Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
Recently we did a 2-week series dealing with male spirituality, and I had a guest that dealt with how men look at certain issues. Over the next 3 weeks, I'm very pleased to announce that we're going to deal with a number of women's issues, and both today and next week we have 2 guests that are so qualified to deal with this subject. I welcome to the program 2 representatives of the Women's Center, and this particular center is located in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and I want to welcome them, and for certain security reasons we are not giving the entire name, but I would first of all welcome Sue to the program, and Sue is involved with violence prevention expert at the center. And Sue, thank you for taking so much time to be with us.
Thank you.
And I'm equally pleased to have Dorothy, or she goes by Dot, and she is the sexual assault victim advocate, and she comes with a very distinguished background, as does Sue, which we'll probably get into in a minute as we deal with this program. We're going to deal with a variety of issues relating to women on this show, and then next week we'll be concentrating very heavily on dealing with combating violence. And with that, I'm pleased to welcome our panel, Janelle Burke, an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Erna Reinhardt, who's Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College, and Janelle will commence today's questioning.
It's a pleasure to have you here, and I'm going to do a little series of what, who, why, and so forth. Let's start out. What is a women's center? And let's start with you, Dot, and can you tell us what is a women's center?
The Women's Center began, its inception was in 1977 here in Kootenai County. I think we were almost a pioneer program here in the state of Idaho. What we are is a refuge for women and children who are fleeing domestic violence. We offer assistance in a variety of ways. We have several different programs. There's the sexual assault program, the court program, the shelter, counseling, and in a nutshell, what we do is we shelter women and children fleeing a dangerous situation. We provide counseling free of charge to them. If there's sexual assault, I'm the program manager, and I will assess the needs of the victims, walk them through the court program if necessary, line them up with law enforcement, help them with that interviewing process, help them with crime victims compensation program. And of course, I'm not alone in that. There's many others who help out as well.
And why, Sue, do we need this kind of thing? Why do we need a women's center?
I think every community needs a women's center. I mean, not just us. I think that we live in a society where we need to assist people who are in a position where they can't get help for themselves. The level of violence in this society, especially against women and children, is fairly high. And so all communities need a program where women feel that they can go and get assistance without, sometimes without any money, without any support of any other nature. And that's why.
You've told us a little bit about who and why, or why and where, and what it is about. But now I want to ask you a little bit about who you are and just a background, because I know that you would speak for many of the other people who are involved in women's centers. Other staff members would have similar backgrounds to yours, but I think our viewers would find it interesting to perhaps, let's start with you, Dot, just say a little bit about your background, what makes you qualified to work with women at women's centers.
Begin with these programs who have some social services degree, or they've had some crisis intervention training of one type or another, or they've interned with us or another agency of similar to our type. I've had my start with the Bonner County Sheriff's Office in Sandpoint, Idaho, and was with their crime victim advocate program for 5 years and responded with law enforcement or behind law enforcement to the scene of a domestic or a sexual assault, or responded to the ER, and received a lot of my training through various trainings offered through the state of Idaho, 3 days in June, and child abuse, sexual investigations, and so forth through the Sheriff's Office, many different trainings through them.
And how about you, Sue?
My background's in law enforcement as well. I started as a law enforcement officer on a relatively small department in central Illinois, and worked. Part of my job while I was there for about 5 years was handling sex crimes. So I worked a lot with sexual abuse cases and rapes. And then when I left there, I went to work at the University of Illinois Police Training Institute, which is a training academy and specialized training for law enforcement officers. And now I continue to do a lot of training.
Erna Reinhardt.
Welcome to the show, both of you.
Thank you.
Tell me a little bit about how people come to you. Do the women that come to you for assistance, or sometimes it's men, or sometimes it's probably children? Talk first of all, I guess, of who comes to your center for help, but then also how do they find you? Are they referred to you? Do they call you directly? Does law enforcement get involved? Tell us a little bit about how people end up coming to you for your services.
You just
Dot.
about answered a lot of that. Word of mouth through a friend, referrals from doctors' offices. I would say the majority referrals through law enforcement. Yeah.
You name it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And help us define a little bit about what it is that we're talking about when you say sexual assault. What all does that include?
And I'm taking it right from our PowerPoint presentation, but I couldn't describe it any better than this. But sexual assault includes several crimes: rape, incest, forcible fondling, lewd and lascivious acts with a minor. Basically, in a nutshell.
Those are the crimes that it includes in the state of Idaho. In other states, they may have different names, but the general idea is the same.
Types of sexual assault can be stranger rape, acquaintance rape, marital rape, gang rape, date rape.
Awesome. And how do you help these people through the process?
First and foremost, if they make contact with us we have a 24-hour crisis hotline, sexual assault crisis hotline. Oftentimes, people make their first contact with us through that hotline number. Other times, it's made via law enforcement or a friend, word of mouth. And then we assess their needs, whether or not they want to proceed with the rest of the justice system, if they know the perpetrator and want to make him accountable for it, whether or not we don't force anybody to do anything that they are not comfortable with, though. And I think a lot of agencies act the same way statewide or throughout our nation, every state. We walk the whole court program with them. We also provide that counseling to them, which is very important. Some people who call our hotline number are rape victims who have never reported, and maybe the rape occurred years ago. Maybe they were a child who experienced incest or molestation issue. So I would say, guesstimating, a good half of the people that call on the crisis hotline are people who have had a recent incident of sexual assault or rape.
Our program goes into 7 states and into Canada. It's international in that sense, and I'm always very cognizant of the fact that our viewers are many places and that you can be a great help to them. Not only have you not only done a great job already dealing with local questions that you were asked, but let's make this a little more international. First of all, it's my understanding, certainly in this country, and I'm sure in Canada too, that women's centers have sprung up all over the country for the reasons you've given, that domestic violence has been on the increase, unfortunately. Sue, I'll start with you, and let's talk about how women's centers are oftentimes, this is positive, not negative, divided, not in a conflict, but they divide their services in different ways. Would you share that with us?
Sure. Around the country, women's centers and women's programs operate a lot differently, not only in our country, but in other countries as well. In a lot of areas, the sexual assault advocacy programs are separate from the domestic violence advocacy programs. One might be run through for lack of like Catholic Social Services or Lutheran Social Services, and the other one might be a separate nonprofit. That's actually, most of the time, domestic violence programs started with a shelter. Okay? So lots of times they're separate.
Where you have these services together because of our size and
Our
all that.
size.
But the point you're making with viewers in other places, they may be totally separated in totally different organizations.
But they are very similar in
Yes.
that their goal is to provide advocacy for victims of domestic violence or sexual assault. So, as Dot was just talking, I was thinking, really what they do with a victim is advocate for him. And whatever that particular victim needs, their programs will try to advocate to help get those needs met. And that's how programs all around the country work. That's why I don't know if you picked up on one of the things she said was that if it's not in a victim's best interest, or they choose not to take a certain avenue, they will advocate for what the victim wants.
Absolutely. It's the voice of the victim, and we are the stand up for.
Yeah.
I'm just so fascinated with that because some of us are involved in some human rights organizations, and there are many kinds of victims. And in our case, we are, certainly if it's in those arenas, we would refer to you. There's things we refer to human rights commissions at the state level in government. But certainly there are hate crimes in which someone's been really assaulted because they're Jewish or because they're gay or because whatever the category might be. And we are the same way. We say to the victim, we don't try to dictate that you'll do a certain thing. What are your needs? Do you want to be public with this? Do you want to be private? And so I commend you for that. I have another question that's more global in perspective too in relation to this, and start with you, Dot, and invite both of you to talk about this. You've indicated that domestic violence has been on the rise in our country and other countries in recent years. Could you give us some kind of profile of situations where it's most likely to happen, domestic violence, or secondly, what are some of the factors behind this happening? To prevent this in the future, to make progress, you need to know the reasons behind it. It's like going to a doctor. If you can diagnose what the disease is, then you can treat it.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me start out by saying with a lot of other great research and people who have done profiling and so forth, we say why. There's so many different whys, and there's a lot of typologies and different profiles of an abusive person, and there's a lot of understanding and we're still understanding a lot of the different profiles of some who have been victims. And I could go on and on about some training that probably Sue and I have both had in the arena of typologies of profilers, and what causes a person to batter another person is they've narrowed it down to simply power and control.
That's the number one reason that person's trying to have power and control over the other person or the children.
And oftentimes it is a learned behavior. I would say the majority of the time. We talk about the cycle of violence. We educate our women that come to see us, and or men, about the cycle of violence and how it's perpetuated, and it's so often learned in an early stage of childhood and witnessed by children. We could go off for quite a while on.
Ask Sue to add to that.
Yeah. I call it the intergenerational cycle of violence. There's really two cycles. One's a cycle that happens within the relationship itself, and the intergenerational cycle is where, and I can even tell you in my 15 years in law enforcement, which wasn't that long, I was dealing with I was handling domestics that involved the children of people that I handled domestics with in my early years, toward my late years. And any law enforcement officer will tell you that in their career they see the grandchildren, and it's the same families. It's learned behavior.
It goes on and on.
And it perpetuates itself.
And the whole process, the whole movement of these shelters springing up, so forth, I believe is, we're trying to break that cycle. We're trying to teach women how to enable and empower themselves and remove themselves from that dangerous situation and break the cycle so that their children don't perpetuate the tragedy that they watch their parents.
There's so many questions going on. I'll go back to the panel in my next round or next week. There's many questions that come off of those questions.
Yeah.
Janelle?
Well, I wanted to go back to educating because that's part of the whole purpose of your work and also of this program, and that is educating people what exactly is sexual assault. It doesn't necessarily have to be battering, although, of course, in its most extreme forms it is. And I liked very much that you have a handout that kind of shows it as a flame, that it goes up and becomes more serious as it goes up. But what about sexual assault that doesn't involve battering? And let's start with Dot, and then we'll go over to Sue and add along as you go if you like.
If you're talking about that doesn't involve the whole family dynamic?
Well, not necessarily that doesn't involve the whole family dynamic, but sexual assault can be words as well as not necessarely hitting someone.
Absolutely.
So
it
let's
can
talk a
be
little
sexual harassment. It can be looks. That's a whole nother topic too. But yes, sexual assault predominantly, though, takes the form of forcible fondling or lewd and lascivious acts, but it can be exposing oneself. It can be words that are spoken. You're correct. Is there something else? Sue?
And let's talk about the escalation then.
I think you might be referring, it's hard because we kind of differentiate between sexual assault and domestic violence.
Perhaps we
Domestic violence, even though they cross over a lot.
Oftentimes.
Yeah.
Describe for our viewers. So they're
When we're talking
like
about
me,
domestic
yeah.
violence, we're talking about
Understand.
violence that occurs within some kind of family setting.
Or intimate relationship.
You know, some kind of a relationship, a dating relationship, marriage, ex-marriage, sibling relationship. In some states, that's also considered part of domestic violence. When we're talking about sexual assault, that may also include assault of a sexual nature upon somebody who you don't have a relationship with.
Exactly.
But the majority of sexual assault in our country is acquaintance sexual assault. So it is committed by somebody that the victim knows and probably has spent time with, either on a date or in a relationship of some kind.
It can be the boyfriend who suddenly morphs into a rapist. We have some statistics, even nationally and state-wise, that indicate the highest age group is around the age of 18 to 24, college-age students, for victims of sexual assault, date rape, predominantly, acquaintance rape.
So we recognize those things, and that's very important, that we recognize the whole gamut and that it's out there and can understand that there is help for it.
And you were right when you said it starts minor. I mean, it starts, family violence, domestic violence often starts words alone. You know, it's threatening, it's power and control over finances, it's power and control over who you will be friends with. It's, no, I don't like the way you've cleaned the house. I want you to clean it differently. Or I don't like the fact that that you're not driving the children to school every day. I don't want them taking the bus anymore. That type of power and control, which may not rise to the level of a crime, but is the beginning of this escalation. And then a bit at a time, it may get worse.
Absolutely. So often that's the case with acquaintance rape or sexual assault. A bit at a time, they gain your trust, and it's after they get your trust that oftentimes then they take control sexually.
Erna Reinhardt.
I have a two-part question. Number one, those examples that you gave were awesome, and I want to go from there. If there is a partner that finds themselves in a relationship where those kinds of things are happening, tell us some things that partner might do to try to change or alter that situation. And then the follow-up question would be, if you are a family member where your daughter or your husband is in that situation, or your sister or something, or a friend, what can those people do to help find a solution to that problem?
Yeah, I think you started to give part of the answer to the first part when you asked the second part. In other words, the most important thing that somebody can do when they're in a relationship and they start to recognize that there are signs and symptoms that this is a potentially dangerous relationship is to talk to somebody about it. Okay? And I'm not saying, preferably they're going to call an advocate and get expert advice. But I also recognize that a lot of victims can't do that for a lot of different reasons. But they can talk to a friend. They can talk to a parent. They can talk to a sibling. They can talk to a priest or a minister. They can talk. I mean, there's a lot of people out there who...
Even that in itself's got to be difficult, though, because then they feel, or they're made to feel guilty, right? So even that first step is a difficult one.
Henceforth, women's centers and shelters where there's confidentiality and anonymity. So often they feel that that's their refuge. But there's a lot of situational factors why women maybe don't speak up about it, why maybe they keep returning and so forth. Lots of situational factors.
I think the biggest thing that we hear from audiences when we're talking to people about domestic violence, especially, is why don't they just leave? And the question what we try to turn it around to is the question is not why she didn't leave. Now I say she because 95% of the time the victim is a female, although I do recognize that.
Right.
You know, there are male victims of domestic violence too. We got to get away from that. Why didn't she just leave?
It's like mixing oil and water.
Yeah.
The question is, why does the perpetrator batter?
Mm-hmm.
You know, we need to, although it's much easier for us in society to say, well, you know, she needs to get smart and get out of it.
Right.
The more we learn about it and the more we educate people, there's a million reasons why she doesn't get out of it.
It may not be a safe time for her to leave at that time.
You know, there
We
may-
like to give a lot of information, Sue, on
There's-
safety tips and so forth to prepare in leaving, and safety tips for after leaving. Sometimes it's they're either not ready to get out just yet. They know when it's safest.
Or they have to take it. They have no finances. They have children involved. They have, I mean, I always say, you know, something happened in my relationship, and, you know, with my husband. We've been married 20 years. Let's say something out of the blue happened. It wouldn't be easy for me to walk out on this, no matter how awful it was.
You touched on a big one. In almost 7 years that I've been working as a victim advocate, I would say there's a big part with some victims that is a four-letter word called hope. They hope that person will get help. They hope that person will become the person that they first met.
So how about, let's go back to if you are a friend and someone confides in you, give us some ideas for what to do then.
The number one thing is to listen, and to try to listen non-judgmentally. And that's why I went to the why doesn't she just leave. It's very, very easy for us to say, well, get out. Duh. When it's not that simple.
Right.
So the number one thing is to listen and to allow her. What I know when we do training, especially with law enforcement, we always say it takes a victim on average 7 times of trying before they'll leave. So we don't expect it to happen the first time. So if I was talking to family and friends, that's the number one thing I'd say is don't get impatient. And don't get mad because she doesn't take your advice the first time.
That's good.
Keep listening to her, keep providing her with options, keep telling her where she might go for other help. You know, keep being a friend or a good friend.
It may be difficult also for them to even speak out about it. They may be quite embarrassed or feel ashamed because so often some of these victims take the blame on themselves. That's a whole nother arena we could go into. But the thing is, too, is just like Sue said, just provide that non-judgmental support, and yet, however, don't buy into their denial. If they are minimizing, there are ways to just specifically state, I'm afraid for you. I want you to know that there is a hotline number you can call. There is a place you can go. And being that person's friend. Absolutely, if that person is in a dangerous situation where they've called you on the phone and it looks like it's escalating or he is beating on her, then
a good friend is going to make the 911 call.
Yep.
Thanks.
There's a lot of questions that arise from your comments, and the good news is that you'll be back next week and we will pursue those, and I hope our viewers will come back. This is a very serious topic and very important, but we do have a little time left, and I do want to address one of those that has come up, and you said a minute ago, Dot, this is a whole other issue, and it is. We read about or in our own work in human rights and working with and have connection with groups like yours, and I'll start with Sue because it deals with domestic violence. On a number of occasions, for example, if it's a spouse, a woman who's being so terribly abused and she stays, and sometimes even to the point where she's not only beaten very badly or even unfortunately death sometimes. And again, like the question you said, we have to ask a different question, but when the victim says, it's my fault, I've done something that caused this to happen, that again is a real serious problem, that it isn't her fault, but what do you say and how do you work through with women to get them over this point that they have somehow, every time it happens, they have initiated when they haven't?
I think a lot of where you have to start is from the premise that that victim has learned that from the abuser. That victim has bought into, all the methods that the abuser has used to beat that victim's self-esteem down as well.
Could be other members of the family that don't engage in the violence, but they also have had a role in playing in this loss of self-esteem.
You're right. You're right. So you have to start there, from that premise. And then it takes some working with that victim. That's why a lot of women's programs around the country will offer support groups, not just individual counseling, but support groups where they're in a situation where they can hear it from other women who have been there and come out of it and recognize, that was inappropriate, that it wasn't their fault. And so, but it's not something that happens overnight either, and you have to recognize that. It's like
patience.
working with friends. Yeah.
And Dot, would I be, not knowing all the terminology, when you're in a support group like that and you such help from other women who've gone through the process, but is it almost like a deprogramming process where you're getting, maybe that's a wrong term to use.
No,
but
it's an interesting term.
That's very good.
Yeah.
I could say so. Yeah, I think so. Oftentimes at different support groups, there's facilitators who will help keep the program on track, and sometimes they let it deviate a bit and let the women engage and recover and heal. But yes, the victims have to oftentimes relearn and rethink about themselves and begin to see themselves as valuable. So oftentimes, like Sue says, they are so convinced by the abusive partner that they're not worth much.
So the healing can't start or things change until they recognize it's not their fault.
It can start.
Things
can change.
Okay.
But true
healing.
Reintegration of that person can't happen until they recognize it.
Okay.
I don't think.
On that note, we have to bring the program to conclusion. On behalf of our panel and our staff, Dot and Sue, thank you. This has been most informative, and we will have you back next week, and we will pick up on some of these very important issues that we were not able to completely finish this time. But I know you've been helpful to our viewers, and we are very confident they will come back to hear the second part of this series. Ladies and gentlemen, again, we thank you for viewing our program today, and as I just indicated to our guests, we will have them back for part 2 next week on these very important issues, and I hope you will be with us then. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.